Hello to everybody out there in Facebook land, LinkedIn land, and YouTube land. Welcome to our next conversation here in our inaugural roundtable at Parent Twain Connection. For those of you I haven't met, I'm Clarissa Constantine. I'm the founder. And our mission at Parent Twain Connection is to bring all of the adults that it takes, all the villagers it takes to raise a child together. Sometimes you just need another parent for moral support and yeah, been there, done that. But sometimes you need more support from folks who have more specific knowledge. And I'm thrilled to have Dr. Melissa Durtschi with us. She is a good friend of mine and an amazing professional. So, first of all, Dr. Durtschi, thank you for being here.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
So, you pursued your PhD in the first place. You had been a special education teacher yourself, and your husband is also in the mental health profession. And you found yourself navigating a diagnosis for one of your kids. I know you talk about this openly, and had a hell of a time navigating it. And you were like, if we're having this kind of difficulty, what do people do who aren't special educators? How do they support their kids? Hence, your business, Navigating Education.
Yeah. Yep. So navigating education came from both personal and professional experience. Like you said, trying to navigate through my own family, figuring out we have twin daughters. We have 4 children, but twin daughters are our eldest. And it was a very different experience going through it as a parent than when I was on the other side of the table and helping families through the journey. And so it was a huge desire for myself, personal passion, professional passion, to help other families journeying through that. And it actually came from, so navigating education, my personal involvement in it came from, and my desire to get my doctoral degree came when we were going through that with our Abigail. Is because it was so hard for our family. It was stressful. We lost sleep trying to write the emails that I knew. Anyway, it was really, really difficult. So I get the pleasure of helping families that need the help and support that I couldn't find at the time, to help them navigate through the educational system, therefore navigating education.
And that's what I love about people like you. And by the way, for those of you who are watching, Dr. Durtschi is actually also one of our trusted experts. So she was one of the founding members of our Trusted Expert Network. They're folks that we have background checked, reference checked, and who we have kind of given at least a preliminary stamp of approval of like, hey, these people are really good at what they do. So she's here in Colorado, but she can help folks nationwide. But tonight, Dr. Durtschi, we're talking about IEPs and 504s. Those are numbers and letters that get thrown around very casually in social circles, but a lot of people don't even know the basics about them. So should we start with what is the difference between an IEP? What does IEP even stand for?
Perfect. Let's go there. So IEP is an individualized education plan. The idea is that it's specific to that child for their needs and what they specifically, the services that they need to be able to be successful. So the biggest difference between an IEP and a 504, there are a couple. The number one difference is that they are covered under different laws. So IEPs are under the Disabilities Education Act, so IDEA. And then 504s are going to be under the Office of Civil Rights. So they're covered under different things. They're thrown around in special education as very similar, but they are covered under different laws. The basic between them, 504, how I always explain it is 504s are going to be access to education in the general classroom. They are accommodations that a general education teacher can provide to families, or not to families, to students in the classroom, whereas an IEP is going to be that they are significantly impacted and need specialized instruction. Therefore, a special education teacher that has a master's, usually they can have higher than that, but master's degree in special education, to be able to make the progress that they need. So the biggest thing is the funding, right? It all comes down to money. An IEP is going to be the funding comes from federal, state government, and it's going to fund the special education provider, the special education. Now, it can be academics. It can also be occupational therapy, speech language, all of those things. But that's the basic difference.
Okay.
Because an IEP, you can also get accommodations within the classroom. A 504 is going to focus on just the access to the education within the general classroom. So accommodations.
Can you give me an example of what that would be? Because I don't have a kid a child in the educational system. I also haven't worked in the educational system. So can you give us some examples of accommodations or access in the general classroom? I'm clear on the
Absolutely.
definition, but I'm not yet clear on what it looks like.
Yeah. So an accommodation that can be either on a 504 or an IEP. You can have accommodations that go across both of those. So one example would be copy of teacher notes. Let's say that a student has a impacted processing speed and they have a hard time, or they have an auditory processing disorder and they have a hard time taking in the information auditorily. They use so much of their energy listening to the concept and processing it that way that their notes are jumbled on the page and they just can't take notes. So copy of teacher notes, where then they can take side notes on the side, but when they go back to study, it's very clear on there. One other example, there's lots of them, but one other example would be, let's say a student with dyslexia needs audiobooks, and that's in their learning profile. So they need an audiobook, and it can be provided to them at no cost to the family, access to the literature that they will be learning in the classroom. They would get that through their plan and have access to it. So they could listen to it and see it.
Got it. So then what are the kind of things, because you said that those kinds of things can cross over between IEPs and 504s. What are some examples of things that are more specific to an IEP that would require the special education support?
Sure. So on an IEP, they're specifically going to have goals that are written to progress monitor over time. So let's say that a student with a profile of a reading disability, we're going to progress monitor the number of words that they can read in a minute. It could be fluency based, it could be phonics based. We're going to progress monitor over time, and we're going to write a goal that by the end of 1 year time period, we're going to check in a year, they will have made X number of growth. Let's say that a baseline is going to be really important in that. A baseline of they have 50% right now knowledge of, let's say they are a fourth grader and they have 50% knowledge of the second grade curriculum. We're going to say by the end of in 1 year's time, they will have made at least 1 year's progress. So we would write a goal that would be third grade level at 70% of the knowledge. So one of the biggest differences is going to be the goal and the progress monitoring over time, because you're going to have access to the specialized instructors that have the funneling of funds from the state and local government and federal government for the not the test, but you're going to have access to them.
Right. And so if there's the goal and the progress monitoring, what that also says to me is that then maybe they're pulled out of class for a certain number of hours a week and get personalized support on whatever it is that they need to, whatever the skills are to help meet that goal.
Absolutely. Okay. Yep. And that's called a service delivery statement. So they're going to have X number of time that's agreed upon with the whole team, the school-based, district-based, parent-based team, that they agree upon on how much time each week, each month will be required for the student to make the goals.
Got it. How frequently are those monitored? I know you said you gave an example of a goal of about like an annualized goal. Are we looking at that on a monthly basis, a quarterly basis?
Traditionally, I was going to say traditionally, it's going to come out when grades come out. So if your school is set up on quarters, then you can expect it whenever their grades come out for the quarter system. If it's semester based, you can expect to have information as the semester ends.
Got it. Okay. Thank you, because I'm sure I'm not the only person who, I mean, even though I've lived on one side of the educational world for a long time, this is not an arena that I live in. And so I'm sure I'm not the only one who isn't clear on all of that. So then I know one of the things that you and I were talking about as we were getting ready for this conversation was there are some accommodations that families would never think of that they can request in either an IEP or a 504, I think you said, or maybe it was just
Mhm.
more 504. But what are some of the types of things that families can ask for?
I'm going to specifically talk about high school aged
Sure.
students.
Yeah.
So specifically for that, a lot of people are not aware that you can request. There's a little bit of hoop jumping, of course, because it needs to be approved through different levels. But let's say that my student is going to be taking the ACT, SAT. The school and the parent can apply for extended time, let's say, on those types of things.
Hmm.
And so is that's helpful for when if they you have to demonstrate that you've used it over time and things like that. But if it's written into an IEP or a 504, you do have the right to be able to apply for those. So
Hmm.
that might be a big thing for ACT and SAT
Absolutely.
testing.
I was going to say that's also something I know our exclusive conversation that we're going to have here in a couple of minutes with Parent Tween Village members is transitioning to college and helping students who have whatever variation of accommodations at the high school level. How do they advocate for themselves to receive support at the collegiate level? I know from my experience, you've like you said, you've got to show that you've used those accommodations over time to be able to get the SAT and ACT accommodations. So what I will say to folks listening is that if your kids are like, wow, whatever, I don't need the extra time, use it at least on occasion,
Mhm,
because if you don't, you lose it. That's a great
mhm.
situation of if you don't use it, you lose it.
Yep. And yeah, when it's reviewed every year, they're going to have data about has it been used, has it not been used, which accommodations, you go item by item, just which ones have been used and which ones haven't. I would say the one other thing that I would recommend for middle school, high school students and their families, or parents, you mentioned advocacy, right? And we talk a lot about that in education, especially when we get to secondary, so middle school and high school, about the students being able to advocate for themselves. And sometimes it can be very difficult because they're not there yet.
Mhm.
We have to meet them where they're at. One of the things that I recommend to families that come in and talk with us is sitting down with your child and going through what are the top 3 things that a teacher could do that would demonstrate to you that they are working to meet your needs in the general classroom. So your general education teacher, what are 3 things that they could do? Is
Mhm.
it repeating instructions? Is it giving you audiobooks? Some kids don't like audiobooks because they have to have some headphones on. They just want to read it at home. Totally
Mhm.
fine. But getting them involved before they have to sit in an IEP meeting with lots of people around the table, getting that information beforehand, even recording them if that's necessary. If you have a very introverted student, recording them and then playing that excerpt for the team.
That's awesome.
It's a lot harder to turn down a student than it is for to turn down parents. So
I see what
getting
you're doing there.
yeah, so getting your kids involved, because that way you can check in on those 3. Yes, there might be more, but those 3 are the most meaningful for them. And when they say, "Well, the teachers don't at all do what I need," well, have they been able to prioritize for them what it means for somebody to help them? And
Sure.
many times they're like, "I'm not even sure." And so it
Right.
opens up a good conversation.
Sure. Well, and I love the idea of, audiobooks and, um, and I didn't have audiobooks when I was a kid. I'm one of those kids who would have hated it, but I know my husband loves them, and we think he falls into that, some aspect of dyslexia or like reading. I mean, he's brilliant. He's an engineer for crying out loud, but the reading process doesn't work as comfortably for him. But he loves audiobooks and he listens to a ton. I don't remember half of what I heard in an audiobook because half the time I'm listening to something else. But for him, like he can totally tune into it and like I know he retains it because he quotes stuff to me later.
Yeah. I love that because it's a different way of thinking. That's how I always approach it.
Mhm.
That it's a different way of thinking, not a better way of thinking. You know,
For
like
sure.
when we have learning differences, it's that our brain tends to gear. I mean, that's why we have different professions throughout the world. You know, not everybody is going to be an engineer, not everybody's going to be a teacher. And thank goodness that there's so many different options. And
Right.
it's because our brains think differently. And there's a lot of misconceptions from myths of the past from when I was younger.
Mhm.
I'll, do my age when I was going through school in the 80s and 90s of what special education, what gifted education, what general education looked like, sounded like, and how you experienced it. And it's very different now.
So I'd like to chat for just a second. My final question before my final question. You mentioned gifted. Do kids who are gifted or get the title, the moniker, or whatever, do they have IEPs as well? Because I remember I was in that category and I remember being pulled out for different stuff, but like I don't remember an IEP.
Yeah, each state calls it something different. Some states put it together into an IEP, an individualized education plan. Many states do it as an ALP, an advanced learning plan.
Okay.
If a student needs, there is some type of a plan. Let's put it that way. It depends on the state what it's going to be
Who knew?
called, but there is a plan.
Okay.
Also, with that, just as kind of a, if you want to learn more, twice exceptionality is one of so it's an area that I love because twice exceptionality is going to be giftedness and a learning difference such as a dyslexia and ADHD or something like that, where you have both.
Mhm.
And it's fascinating to me how sometimes we identify a student as gifted and then we're like, but they're not thriving in a gifted setting. Why? So then you're trying to figure out their learning differences. Sometimes students with, let's say, sometimes a social emotional disability, sometimes that programming is because we've overlooked sometimes an exceptionality of giftedness.
Mhm.
And, there's just so many layers to a twice exceptional kid. And those are some of the kids that I enjoy working with because there's so many layers. And many times they will have, because they're working on both ends of that bell curve, they have some of the most fascinating answers to things. And I'm like, I've never thought of that before. I'm going to have to look more into that. Do you have recommendations on where I can look into that? Because their minds think outside of that box, that
Mhm.
we say,
Mhm.
working outside the box, and it's their playground.
It
And
is,
I
yeah.
love it because they can share such insight and it shows their personalities, and I love it.
That's awesome. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and invite us to wrap up with my final question, even
Okay.
though I have so many more, but I promised you that was the final before the final. So we're going to stick with that. I've been asking at least almost all of our roundtable guests, which of the foundations of connection stands out the most for them. So, for those of you who aren't familiar with the foundations of connection, these are available as a free download on our website. And these basically are an outgrowth of a conversation that I had with myself a few years ago. I've been an SAT coach for 20 some odd years, and a lot of my kids would talk to me about things that I knew they weren't ready to talk to mom and dad about. And I was like, why? Why are they talking to me? So for those of you who don't know them, I'm going to say them quickly. And then I'm going to ask Dr. Durtschi which one is popping up most for her today. So here we go. C is for create a safe place. Then we have observe, non judgment, nod and smile, explore, challenge your truths or curiosity, take your time, innovate, own your own story, and nurture. All right, lay it on me. What are you thinking tonight?
So I think it can go across a couple of them, but the one that stands out to me is exploring because so my background is I worked in public education, worked K through 12, primarily in elementary school, but now I've worked K-12 and beyond. I didn't realize, even in the system of public education, how many options there truly were and free options that didn't have to be like a private school. And so I'm going to stick with explore because explore your options. That there may be options that you're not even aware of in your area, that even just changing schools, that you don't have to be fix on one setting. If that setting is not meeting the needs of your child, both the school can be great and your child can be great, and it's just not a fit. And that's okay. But to look at, there are possibilities elsewhere and to explore different options. I didn't realize how many options there were. So exploring would be the thing that stuck with me tonight, is exploring your options and learning about being able to ask people so that we can take off the blinders of this is the pathway. You have to do it this way. It's either public education or private education that I can't afford. But there's so many different options, and I didn't realize how many options there were.
Wow. And you were a special educator in the school system and didn't know. So that leads me to think that if you didn't know all of them, many of us aren't going to know all of them. So,
Yep.
All right, awesome. All right, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. Dr. Durtschi, thank you so much for being with me.
Absolutely.
And,
it was my pleasure.
For folks who are listening, you can find Dr. Durtschi at navigatingeducation.com. If you've got kids that you think might be dealing with learning difficulties or differences, or you just, I know you do a complimentary, 15-minute consultation, I think you've told me?
It's actually 30 minutes, yeah.
Oh, 30 minutes. Okay, cool, double. She can give you some insight and guidance as to what might be appropriate steps for your kiddos. So we'll make sure that all of your contact information is on the show notes and on the links in all the places where we're at. And thank you so much. We are going to be almost forgot, we're going to be transitioning over to an exclusive conversation for members of Parent Tween Village, talking about transitioning from high school to college. So if you're in Parent Tween Village, make sure to check it out. If you're not yet, you can join us at parenttweenconnection.com. So thank you, Dr. Durtschi.
Absolutely.